Hi, this is John Laban from the Open Compute Project. I'm going to be talking about circular economy and open source technologies and how open source hardware acts like well-rotted horseshit for growing the circular economy. My agenda today is hopefully I'll have a good chat with you, so fingers ready on the chat boxes. I'd like to see questions and comments coming in, please. Try and make it interactive so I get some feedback. I'm going to look at cyclic renewal tattoos as proof that Homo sapiens did once operate in a circular economy. Looking at some circular economy diagrams and looking at Homo sapiens as slaves to intellectual ideas of economists and how that fits in with the EU Green Deal. Gratuitous hardware product differentiation, and lastly, I can just move my picture a bit. We're going to look at examples of open source collaboration. So, the Open Compute Project started in 2011 and it's about open source hardware. It's not just for software anymore. So, I'd like you to drop some questions into the chat box as we're going along. And let's start with one question. What is this? Have you seen it before? Can you describe it? What is this? Now, just to take us back in time, Ouroboros is a symbol which originates from the ancient Greek iconography. And it's a symbol for eternal cyclic renewal, and this is what we're trying to get back to with the new circular economy. But we've been there before. You may have seen the snake eating its tail, the dragon eating its tail. Here we are with one of the many circular economy diagrams, but just to focus in on one thing. It's about paying attention to design to maximize resource efficiency. You can do a lot up front with the actual input on the design. And it's about reducing stuff, reusing stuff and recycling stuff. This here is a chap called John Maynard Keynes, and John Maynard Keynes, rated probably as one of the great economists of the last century. He once said, "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist." Now, gender economics. In the 21st century, notice the new economists that are changing things, turning the old economic order on its head, are women. And we're starting to get these new models. This 21st century embedded economy model, for example. As you can see, it's embedded because it's embedded in planet Earth. And then we have society, and then we have the economy. And that creates a sustainable system. Sustainability is about the planet, society and the economy. You've got inputs and outputs, and within it you have, at its core, something called the commons, and this is the open source technology collaborative commons. It's interesting, you can go on Google and look how often a word is used, and I looked up commons the other day, how often it was written in books, so from the Google Big Data, and it's interesting, commons fell away from 1860 and now it's on the rise. Another very interesting word to look at is patent, and you can see it had its heyday back in 1880, and since then it's been on the demise with a big fall that's occurred actually in this century. Now this embedded economy model is the basis. It's what the Green Deal is built on. You may have heard of the European Green Deal. This is the President of the European Commission, and there she is talking about the Europe's man on the moon moment, about the transformation of the economic models of yesteryear to the new embodied 21st century economic models that we need to move into in this decade for this century. In the Commons, we start looking at open source, and public money is starting to look at it very seriously. Any finance from the public purse is moving towards open source hardware and software. This is a research project that will be moving the evidence base for future policy decisions on open source hardware and software for publicly financed ICT projects. This is a very good video. You'll get the slides later, but this is worth watching, and it makes the case for public money, open solutions. Now let's start looking at the difference between the open source and the previous proprietary solutions. Let's look at the vendor-driven, closed, myopic design mindset. They build in obsolescence. You've got this 3 to 5 year sweet spot, and then you have gratuitous product differentiation. And I'm going to look at one of those products. Is going to be power supply systems from servers. You've got closed proprietary user lock-in. Great example of this is Cisco routers and their software. And you've got this monolithic integration with proprietary firmware that locks you in again. When we start looking at prosumer driven, this is the consumer getting involved with the design and driving the design with a different motivation to the vendor. So we've got prosumer driven open source design. So what's their objective? What's their motivation? Dematerialisation. They've got no motivation to be producing stuff because they don't produce, they just consume, so they want to minimise that. You've got simplicity, you've got hackable by anyone, you've got open source firmware, you've got openness, you've got a right to repair, and then you've got this unbundling of the software from the hardware, this disaggregation that's key to allowing people to hack. And when I talk about hack, I'm not talking about security hacks, I'm talking about makers, allowing people the freedom to make solutions that are optimized for their requirements. Now something else you see from the vendor side, you see this thing called gratuitous product differentiation. And I'll give you a few examples of it. But one thing that always frustrates me when I go in the supermarket, when I see businesses differentiating their apples, putting these plastic labels on them. What for? It's just a nuisance. But there's an example of product differentiation that's unnecessary and bad for the environment. Now let's look at a basic system of a computer server power supply unit. Fundamentally, this black box, what it does, it takes mains AC input, alternating current inputs, and it gives a 12 volt DC output, direct current output. So it begs the question, why do we need hundreds of different incompatible power supply units? Now if you want to try this out yourself, go on Google Images and search for server power supplies. You will find hundreds of them, hundreds of power supplies, and they're all incompatible. You can't take one from one server and stick it in another server, even within the same manufacturer's products. They're differentiated, different. Now, one thing in this circular economy is the concept of reduction. Let's give you some examples of this. What we've got here, we've got a user-driven simple toolless design. This is a server. This is an OCP server developed by the hyperscalers, working with manufacturers, but them really driving the design with the manufacturers. And then it's open sourced, and you can find this product published on the OCP website. Now, what's interesting about this server is there's a power supply unit, there's the IEC plugs, there's the box that it normally sits in, a traditional server, there's the graphic elements, there's the fancy bezel at the front, there's the server rails with all their thousands of ball bearings. Now, what the user-driven simple toolless design people have done is they've basically hacked it apart, just taken out stuff that's not necessary. So all this stuff that you've just seen there, it's gone. It's not actually in that server. Don't need them. Another example of the reduce emphasis is what they do with open source software. Now, here's a really good example. You can look at this video online. Here we have the CTO of Comcast talking about the transformation of Comcast's telecoms infrastructures towards open source technology. And here he shows two pictures. You've got the before picture with the proprietary solutions, that's 10 racks, and then you've got the after picture on the right hand side, and it's 1 rack. So you can see we've gone from 10 racks, all that spaghetti cabling, all that extra hardware, and we've virtualized it using open source tech down to 1 rack. That's a 90% dematerialisation. Now, just over a year ago now, the Open Compute Project started this circular economy initiative because the hyperscalers, they don't throw their stuff away. It's all recirculated into other economies and other data centers, their gear. And there's various companies doing this, but it's at huge scale. If anybody wants to kind of know more about this, you can talk to me, or the main person is Steve Helvey. Steve Helvey. If you go on the Open Compute website, look for Steve Helvey, contact him. He's based in London, and he'll help you out on any of these things. Now, here's an example of basically the circular economy in Open Compute servers. What this is, a company called Block Heating. On the top left, you've got Jerome, who's the founder of the business. It's a new startup in the Netherlands. And what they do, on the left there, you can see an OCP server. That's air-cooled. Comes out of the Facebook data center, or a hyperscaler data center. And then what they do, they hack it and they convert it from air cooling to liquid cooling to water. And then what they do, they take that water off of that server at a temperature of 63 degrees centigrade, and then they push it through into greenhouses where these small modular data centers are, and they use the heat for growing tomatoes, cucumbers and peppers. But there's a big benefit to this, because they're effectively reducing their costs, because the greenhouse needed to be heated anyway, but you can argue they're getting their energy almost for nothing. They do a deal with the greenhouse, but it lowers their costs, and therefore they can pass that through to their customers with much lower cloud service prices. And you're looking at in excess of 30% reduction, 30-40% reductions in the price of services for cloud services to the consumer of those services. And this is just about joined up thinking. Another company well worth getting to know is this French company called OVH. They are the biggest cloud player that's a European cloud player. Really big, and they have this philosophy of just reuse, reuse, reuse. So when it comes to building a data center, they don't build from scratch. No need. Let's go and find an old industrial unit in an industrial park somewhere, and let's just go in and rework that building and turn it into a data center. Here you've got the founder, Octave Klaber, very interesting guy, well worth following on LinkedIn. He's a crazy musician as well, but he has a very, very different way of looking at building infrastructures, and he will reuse and use open source as much as he can. What you can see there behind him and those racks, they're these OCP air-cooled servers that have been hacked and converted for liquid cooling. And as a consequence of the liquid cooling, it means that he can massively reduce the cost of his cooling infrastructure in his data centers. And so they build the data center facilities or fit out the existing kind of industrial units at such a low cost that they could probably build 4 data centers at the price that the conventional, what we call enterprise tier 3 players would build a single data center. So 4 data centers for the price of 1, and much lower carbon emissions because they're not pouring all this concrete in, the building exists, and they're just reusing it, maintaining utility at the highest level. Well, consequently, they're doing things really low cost, and what do we see here? We see, because they're doing this, they get the lowest prices. So you can see here, there's OVH there. Can you see? It's got the lowest prices for monthly costs for virtual machines across cloud service providers. Now what's interesting, Amazon are here. You can see Amazon now. Now Amazon have huge scale, so you think they have a big advantage, but what Amazon are not doing, they're not doing what OVH are doing in terms of this reuse, this smart reuse. So that gives OVH the ability to undercut the biggest cloud players in the world with the way they do this, and so they've got this environmental business advantage because of the way they approach their designs. Now hopefully that will kill the myth that being green costs money. This guy here, Jamie Lerner, he's a town planner in South America, and I love this quote: if you want creativity, take a 0 off your budget. If you want sustainability, take off 2 zeros. And I think the more I keep looking at it, the more I see the more you move towards the creativity, towards sustainability, you actually end up with much lower financial costs on the initial capital and the ongoing operational. And this just leaves me one more slide, and I hope you're putting some things in the old chat box there. Here we have Larry Ellison. Larry was the founder of Oracle, the big man, and he once said, once open source gets good enough, competing with it would be insane. Now, open source technologies got good enough in the last decade. This decade, we're going to see some massive disruptions with these technologies and moving towards using these technologies to enhance and grow more rapidly the circular economy on ICT. So thank you very much. Looking forward to those questions.